Let's start with the ones that were terrifying and slowly work our way towards the ones that were worse than death. Number 12, rotational therapy. Rotational therapy was heavily used in the US and Europe from the 18th to 19th century and had to be one of the worst experiments ever done in an attempt to cure mental illness. Here, patients were placed on a chair, strapped in, and spun endlessly in circles. The speed would alternate every so often, from a few turns to 100 rotations per minute. Now, of course, for the guy on the chair, this was absolute torture. But for the guy on the lever, this was a great way to tone the biceps. The spinning quickly caused patients to become so disoriented that they would continuously vomit. But if they were one of the lucky few, they would simply pass out and wake up feeling well rested. The reasoning behind the experiment was based on the belief that inducing nausea and dizziness through rapid rotation could reset the mind and calm patients. Number 11, moral therapy. Now, at first glance, moral therapy doesn't sound too bad. After all, it's simply punishing a person in a way you see fit for doing something wrong or breaking the rules. Moral therapy was heavily used in insane asylums from the 18th to 19th century. Now, the real problem was that mental asylum patients weren't very good at following strict rules, since many of them would simply forget the rules or weren't capable of learning from their mistakes. So, they would continuously be punished, back to back to back, which I could only imagine must have been incredibly frustrating, since nobody likes to break a sweat at work. But let's cover the most common punishments that were given. Patients were severely beaten. They were tossed in cells for long periods of time and denied food. They were restrained. They were forced to eat an entire bag of circus peanuts. They received cold water treatment. And of course, they were placed on rotating chairs like we previously covered. Now, the real danger with this method was that workers could subject patients to whatever discipline they wanted at any given time with little oversight. Number 10, hydrotherapy. Hydrotherapy was yet another terrifying experiment that was used in the US and Europe from the 18th to 20th century. There were many methods, but I'll just cover the most common ones. Beginning with the baths of surprise. Patients were placed on a wooden bridge and told to walk across it. As they began to cross, a trapdoor would suddenly open, sending them free, falling into a cold lake below. This was supposedly designed to catch the person off guard in the hopes it would reset their mental state, which really goes to show that even in the darkest of places, there's always room for comedy. Next, the dunking baths. Patients were placed in a large cage, strapped in, and slowly submerged in a freezing cold lake. This was repeated until the patient was visibly on the verge of hypothermia, which was seen as a sign of the treatment was working. Then there was the wet towel treatment. Patients were tightly wrapped in ice-cold wet towels from head to toe and remained wrapped for hours. And finally, the long baths. Patients were submerged in water with only their heads sticking out and left inside for hours or even days. Of course, eventually, straps are added to keep them in place, since they couldn't risk anyone enjoying it. The reasoning behind hydrotherapy was the belief that water could induce relaxation, lower stress and anxiety, and promote healing. Today, we know that this only works when a person chooses to get in the water, not when another person tells you. Number 9, solitary confinement. Isolation cells were heavily used in the US and Europe from the 18th to 19th century. Patients were placed alone in a room and left there for hours or even days. And since many were suffering from severe mental illness, they often had no idea what was happening. Consumed by fear, some began to violently throw themselves against the walls in desperate attempts to escape. severely injuring themselves in the process. By the end of the 18th century, straitjackets had become widely available and were placed on patients before they were thrown into the cells. But again, the jackets didn't stop them from throwing themselves at the walls and getting injured, which really showed the workers. Not wanting to be made a fool of, asylums began converting isolation cells into padded rooms, which finally reduced self-injury, and patients can now be left inside more frequently and for longer periods of time. Number 8. Tranquilizing chairs. The tranquilizing chair was one of the most popular devices used in the U.S. from the 18th through the early 19th century. Here, patients were placed in a chair and had their legs, arms, chest, and head tightly strapped down, preventing any movement. The chair was also equipped with a bucket to catch any human waste. A small box was then placed over the person's head, allowing them to see only what was directly in front of them. They were left alone in the chair for a few hours, but sometimes for as long as several days. Dr. Benjamin Rush was the man who invented the device. He believed that insanity was caused by disrupted blood circulation or sensory overload. So, by preventing the patient from using their muscles, he thought all blood circulation would redirect to the brain and over time cure mental illness. Now, believe it or not, I was a victim of this method and miraculously lived to tell my story. When I was a kid, I was placed in one of these devices. My legs, arms, chest, and head were tightly strapped down. I vividly remember crying out to the world for someone to save me, only to have a device placed in my mouth, keeping it open and preventing me from screaming. Now, of course, once my teeth had been cleaned, I was unstrapped and let go. Number 7. Restraint cages. Restraint cages were used from the 19th to 20th century, and they're exactly what they sound like. Patients were placed inside metal or wooden cages for long periods of time, in the hopes that they would take that time to reflect on their behavior or the bad decisions they had made. But the only issue was the majority of insane asylum patients were not capable of doing that. So instead, they spent their time in the cages becoming more insane. Here's what the cages looked like. Some were a bit larger, allowing the person to take a few steps, while others were so tightly confined that the person could hardly even move. But get this, the time spent in these barbaric cages would depend on the severity of the patient's condition, meaning the crazier the person was, the longer they remained inside. Number 6. Bloodletting. Anyone who's been around my channel should be very familiar with bloodletting since I covered it in this video, but I'll touch on it quickly here. Bloodletting was one of the most popular and horrific medical practices in history, used in many countries from ancient times up to the early 20th century. Here, patients were poked with the blade to remove the bad blood from their bodies, which was believed to cause illness. The severity of the patient's illness would dictate just how much blood was removed and how often. The worse you were, the more they drained. Since mental asylum patients were seen as very sick, it was recommended to drain them to the consistency of a raisin. But after a few sessions, it became obvious that the patient's condition was not improving. So, naturally, doctors came to the logical solution to simply drain more, which of course made things a lot worse, causing even more deaths due to infections and blood loss. Number 5. Fever therapy. Fever therapy was commonly used in the US and Europe during the 20th century. Here, a patient would be injected with malaria to induce a high fever, sending the patient into a thrilling game of life and death for a couple of weeks. Now, if the patient was one of the lucky few who made a full recovery, they would be rewarded with another dose of malaria-inducing fever once again. This was done 8 to 12 times, back to back, which means a patient could remain in an endless cycle of high fevers for around 6 months. But as the bodies piled up, doctors were forced to come to the realization that this method simply didn't work. Not because it was ineffective, but because it must have been injected into the wrong body part. So, they began to inject malaria-contaminated blood directly into the person's brain. Over 1,000 patients received this terrifying treatment, and sadly, around 15% of them died directly linked to this experiment. The theory behind this was that many diseases were eliminated from the body after a person has a fever, so they figured that mental illness could also be cured the same way. Number 4. Insulin shock therapy. Insulin shock therapy, also known as insulin coma therapy, was used in many countries around the world, like the US, Canada, UK, China, and Korea, from the 1920s to the 1950s. Here, mentally ill patients were placed on a bed and were injected with large doses of insulin, causing them to become hypoglycemic and slip into a coma. But the scary part was that many patients would shake or thrash around so violently after receiving their injection that they would dislocate joints or break bones. After a few hours had passed, the patient would eventually recover and wake up just to receive another dose the following day. This would continue on a daily basis for months. There was even a report of a patient who received this treatment for over 2 years. Now, surprisingly, many patients developed obesity thanks to glycogen storage disease, triggered by the daily insulin injections, which is just pathetic, transforming their bodies by injecting instead of achieving it the all-natural way. But sadly, obesity and seizures were not the only dangers. Some patients had it much worse. Many of them died while in a coma or suffered severe brain damage. But believe it or not, doctors would take what they could get and saw brain damage as an overall success. After all, patients completely stopped talking to themselves or really to anyone ever again. The theory behind the operation was that comas were believed to be able to jolt patients out of psychosis and cure them from mental illness. Number 3. Electroconvulsive therapy. Electroconvulsive therapy was heavily used around the world from the 19th to the 20th century. In the 1930s, 2 Italian psychiatrists named Ugo Curletti and Lucio Bini observed that pigs would become extremely calm after receiving an electrically induced seizure. So they figured, why not try this on humans? They first tried it on a patient who was suffering from schizophrenia. And just like the pig, the person woke up from their seizure completely relaxed. So the experiment was deemed promising. The news quickly spread, and soon doctors in psych wards around the world began experimenting with different machines and varying power outputs. But let's cover what the most common procedures looked like. Patients were brought into a room, strapped to a bed chair or table. A rubber wedge would then be placed in their mouths to prevent them from biting off their tongues. Electrodes would be attached to their temples, and what they flip of a switch, the power was activated, and the person was shocked. Electricity would eventually cause the patient to go into a seizure that could last for several minutes. But here's where things get even darker. Many of these patients remained fully awake during the entirety of the procedure, and I can only imagine the levels of fear that this would bring. The experiment would be conducted on a daily basis for weeks or even months, with some unlucky patients receiving multiple sessions per day. Electroconvulsive therapy was seen as being extremely successful, since most patients were so terrified of the procedure that they outright refused to do anything throughout the day in fear of being punished and dragged back. The unlucky patients who received the treatment would live the rest of their lives with severe PTSD and were never the same again. Number 2. Trephination. Trephination was a procedure that was performed in many countries from ancient times up to the 19th century. Many people volunteered to have the procedure done, while others were forced. The procedure began by having the person sit in a chair or strapped down. Then, someone would begin to drill a hole in their head. The holes varied in size, ranging from that of a small pencil to a tennis ball. The procedure was believed to cure chronic headaches and boost mental clarity by releasing unwanted pressure in the skull. Later on, during the 19th and 20th centuries, the procedure was brought in to insane asylums and performed on patients. But this time, it was because they believed that a demon or evil spirit was trapped in the person's head, and the only way to help them was drilling a hole in the skull, allowing the demon to escape. Sadly, this was before the invention of the Ouija board, so simply asking them to leave wasn't yet an option. Many people who received the operation later died from infection. But of course, science moves on, and the operations continued. Throughout history, people continued to experiment with different tools like drills, saws, and even hammers. The hole was even placed on every imaginable location on the skull. Then, of course, some show-offs took it too far and began to experiment with different shapes. Number 1. Lobotomies. Lobotomies are hands down the most terrifying experiment ever done. It all began in 1935 when a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Moniz began to experiment on patients by drilling holes in their skulls. But it didn't end there. He then began pumping alcohol into the skull, completely destroying brain tissue. Thanks to the severed brain connections, the patient's behavior drastically changed and the operation was deemed a success. But Moniz would take it a step further when he began to use a tool called a leucotome, which looked like this. He used it to sever and removed chunks of tissue from the frontal lobe again, causing the patient's behavior to permanently change. Many patients would also lose the ability to move body parts like their arms, legs, or even their face. Surprisingly, in 1949, Moniz won the Nobel Prize for discovering the lobotomy procedure, and many doctors from around the world began experimenting with it. Now, perhaps the most famous doctor in history to ever perform lobotomies has to be Walter Freeman, an absolute maniac. Freeman single-handedly performed over 4,000 lobotomies across the U.S. from 1936 to 1967. Eventually, he created his own lobotomy method, not because it was better in any way, but because it was quicker. He called it the ice pick lobotomy, where he would insert an ice pick directly into the patient's eye socket, then hammer it into the person's brain, scrambling the person's frontal lobe. Now you're probably wondering, how could he possibly know which part of the brain he was scrambling if he couldn't even see? Well, he liked to go by feel. And as you could imagine, many patients quickly die during or after the procedure. But for those who were lucky enough to survive, one thing was certain: they were never the same again, with many losing the ability to function independently. But here's where things get even crazier. Lobotomies became so popular thanks to Freeman's aggressive marketing and miraculous claims that regular people began to seek him out and pay for the operation. But that is a story for another day. In the end, it's estimated that over 100,000 lobotomies were performed in insane asylums across the world from the 1950s to the 1960s, and it remains one of the most terrifying experiments in all of history.